Hello, everyone. This is Peggy from Garden House Studio, and thanks for joining us for today's video. I think I might be the sap bucket queen. I do believe I have painted and decoupaged or put transfers on over 50, maybe 75 sap buckets. At one time, I had 200 of these galvanized sap buckets. The first thing we do for this project is scrub these buckets with hot soapy water. And then it is time to put on a primer. And I'm just using my Pentart bonding primer because this batch of sap buckets had a little bit of sheen to it. And I really wanted something that was going to stick super well to the can, and also I wanted it to be able something that the paint would stick to. So I did all 4 buckets exactly the same, put a coat of primer, washed them, and then put a coat of primer on them. I knew the colors I was going to put on the buckets, and this one I am doing in a color that is super bright, and it is called Bird of Paradise. It is a 1-hour enamel from Wise Owl Paints, and I wanted to do these buckets all a little bit different. I'm actually taking them to a big market, and I know there'll be lots of people with lots of different interests. So I wanted to make them a little more fun. And I know that I'm going to be using the big giant flowers from the Collage des Fleurs. So I am using orange, and then I'm doing a nice green. And the two that I'm actually going to do the decoupage on, I'm painting white. So the orange and the green are 1-hour enamel, and both of them are going to have IOD transfers on them. They already have a built-in top coat, so once they're dry, they'll be ready for the transfers. I am painting 2 of the buckets white, and they are going to have decoupage papers on them. The next step after they all dry will be to embellish them, some with decoupage and some with transfers. The Collage des Fleurs from IOD has 8 pages of mostly huge flowers. And I am going to be using the roses and the little blue flowers and several pieces of the ivy on this big bucket. Now, when I usually like to do a bucket, I like to have some kind of a swag. I usually use 3 main flowers, but these flowers are way too big. I can't use 3. So I'm just going to use 2, and I'm going to use lots of the blue little flowers to kind of offset that. And again, the ivy is going to kind of give it that spriggy kind of wispy look and give it more of a feel of a little swag. So I'm setting up my design with the ivy. I don't want to waste all the ivy underneath those huge flowers. So I'm just going to put the ivy on either side of the center and kind of set the parameters of the design. It's a little difficult to make sure that you see everything as I'm working on the bucket because of where I have to put the camera and how the bucket it's a little difficult working with something that's round. And also these buckets are pretty big. They're bigger than the normal sap buckets that I usually work with. So I continue to cut the ivy and use smaller pieces and just save some of the pieces for at the end to fill in the design. And I think this is going to be pretty boho looking when it's done with all these bright flowers in this super orange bucket. Adding that big flower is really defining the design and where I can put all of the rest of the little flowers. So I'm only using 3 different colors. I'm using the orange bucket, white flowers, and blue flowers, and then basically the ivy, which is kind of pretty neutral. I continue to cut little pieces. I cut parts off and put them in a different place to get the look that I want. The little blue flowers especially. And right now I have one giant rose there, and I am going to put the other big rose on it, and that'll be 2 giant roses, a bunch of little blue flowers, and lots of ivy for this design. I'm using 1-hour enamel because it has that built-in top coat. You don't have to put a top coat on the paint before you add the transfers. I just put a top coat over the transfers, and then it's all done. And then just a couple of finishing touches, and it will be all done. Like I said, I cut these flowers. Sometimes I'm only cutting it so I have just one little flower, and I fit that in. I may cut some of the stem off. I want it to look like they're just kind of hanging out behind the big roses, like an arrangement would. And then, just like that, it's all done. There it is, all done. The second bucket created a bit of a problem because I decided I wanted to use one of the peonies, and the peonies are huge. It was too big to even use two. So for this design, what I did is I went ahead and just plopped the peony right in the middle and then kind of built the arrangement around it. I really like to cut all of my pieces ahead of time and have them in a pile so I know what I'm working with. So I cut them and I lay them in the kind of like in the arrangement that I'm going to use them in. These flowers are really beautiful, and peonies happen to be one of my favorites. So having that gorgeous big peony right there in the middle of the bucket was really perfect. I was able to use a couple other flowers. There are a couple lilies that are just a little bit smaller that I was able to put on this bucket to give it a just change the scale of that giant flower a little bit. So this bucket ended up all pink and rosy with um, a bunch of ivy. So it's like the peony is sitting in this ivy field. And when it was all done, you could see these buckets are pretty old. They have um, parts that are dented in. They were sap buckets, and they were used as sap buckets, so they're kind of dented. Some of them have little places where there's a repair or something. But these are big and they're very heavy duty. And I'm going to do exactly the same as I did on the other bucket. I just cut the pieces. I use smaller pieces. I overlap pieces. I move them around, cut them off of a stem and move them here, there, wherever I need to fill in. And at the end, I took my entomology transfer and I pulled out a few, two butterflies and a dragonfly, and I added some critters to this design. And there's the little butterfly. And here's a butterfly for up at the top. So in order to get the butterfly not to crack, because I've got it overlapping that lip, I do the top part first, and then I do the bottom part. And once that's on, that is the final touch. So there's my giant peony bucket, all set. And now we're going to do some decoupage. The first paper I am using is called Abandoned, and it is this old truck in the middle of a field. And once I get that separated, I am going to decoupage it onto one of my white buckets. And I am just going to use my varnish. It's Wise Owl varnish, and I am using a matte formula. And I used a little bit of water to cut that out so that I would have jagged edges. It's a lot easier to smooth out the edges, and it's much easier to blend the paint of the background, because I'm going to continue that whole background around the whole bucket. And it's much easier to do that if you have a jagged edge. This is Abandoned rice paper, and it is from Decoupage Queen. It's been one of my favorite papers. I just love that old truck. I smoothed it with my hand and really pressed that paper into the bucket, and then I used the varnish over the top of it. And then I am going to let it dry, totally dry. And after it's all dry, I am going to start painting the rest of the bucket. It takes about an hour for this to totally dry. So the first thing I do is I'm going to draw in the horizon line. And again, it's very jagged in the background of this truck picture, so I'm also making it very jagged. And I'm using a gray colored paint. And basically, for me to blend all of that background into this whole can, I'm going to use 4 colors. I'm going to use a yellow, I'm going to use a black, I'm going to use a gray, and a little bit of a green. So it looks kind of funny when I first start. I'm starting with a darker color, putting a gray on the bottom, and I continue to do this around the whole bucket. I add another color, and then I blend it in, and add another color and blend it in. And basically, I'm just stippling, because I'm getting a paintbrush and I'm just wiping off most of the paint, and you'll see me do that. Time to get rid of that towel. It's going to be a messy project. So this is how the whole bucket goes. Just keep blending paint, stippling it on. And I do put a bunch of rust in there. It helps with the rust from the truck. Put it on, blend it in while it's still wet. And I'm using a chalk paint. Much easier to blend chalk paint than it is to blend up paint with an acrylic in it. or enamel. I have 3 different brushes, and I start to take it off on, I'm going to take it off on the paper so I don't have so much paint at one time. So you'll see the paper gets all dotted with color. But see how it blends in? Now you can do this with a sponge if you wanted to, a natural sponge, but I find I get more little feathering and a little bit more edges with the brush. And I'm just going to keep going all around this bucket. It's the yellow that really blends in and gives it that dried up field look. And I'm sorry that this is a little bit off the camera. But you can tell what I'm doing. I'm just continue to add a little layer and then to blend it in, and then add another layer and then blend that in. And that's what it looks like when it's all done, is it's layer upon layer upon layer. And because it's a chalk, it's actually a Wise Owl chalk synthesis paint. Because it's a chalk based paint, it doesn't have any sheen to it. And then also the color doesn't really come to life until you put the top coat on. So you'll see in the final, after I've put in the top coat on it, it really changes it totally. The other thing that I do is, I don't know if you can see, but in the bottom of the car, there's a bunch of scratches right on the paper. So I'm going to use my IOD stamps and some black ink to mimic the design that is actually on the paper, which is kind of a scratched up. It just looks kind of like it was scratched up with black. So we are going to use black ink, and I am using my vintage texture stamps. They sure come in handy when you're trying to mimic some vintage design. So what I do is I get a little paint on, I take most of it off, and then just keep stippling and blending it in. And then I put another coat over it. And the stippling allows it not all to be covered up. Well, I get to a point where I'm pretty happy with it, and I'm pretty happy with this design. I do a little more afterwards, and now it is time to do the stamping. See how that color just kind of blends into the truck in the field? One of the things I do too is I cover some of the paper with the paint so that it's easier to blend. Just going to add, this is again the IOD textured stamp, and I'm just adding a little bit of black over the whole back of the can. There are 4 different stamps in that textured. It just adds to the grungy look of this can, this old truck in the middle of a field. I do the texture around the whole bucket. And the final thing I do is I take one of the stamps, which is it's the peely paint one, and I am going to use green ink, and I'm going to put it along the top of the horizon. And it adds an amazing contrast. It's just dark green ink all along. It's just a peely paint. And just like a little bit of green in the distance. This blending paint takes a little while, but when you're done, it's really amazing. It looks like the whole thing was part of the design. It doesn't look like you painted it at all. And the bottom's done, and now it's time to do the sky. And I do the sky the exact same way. I have 3 or 4 color paints, and I stipple around the whole thing, blending them together. And for the sky, I'm using the same thing, Wise Owl Chalk Synthesis paint. I have a color called sea salt, and a blue, a little bit of gray, and I just continue around the whole can. For bucket number 4, I am using Roy Cycled Spring Blocks paper. So it has 4 blocks, and I am using the ornate design with the sheep in the middle. And I cut it out again with a paintbrush and water so I would have a nice jagged edge, which makes it so much easier to decoupage the edges and to blend it in. So I spritz the front of my paper lightly with water and it starts stretching. And then I am going to put down the varnish. I'm using Wise Owl varnish as my glue and as my decoupage medium. And you'll see there was a crease right down the middle, but once I spritzed it and lay it down, that crease totally disappears off the bucket. I'm doing it very carefully because the buckets have kind of divots and stuff in them, and they could easily cause a little tear with the tissue paper. This is tissue paper. The last bucket we did, we used rice paper. Mostly just press it with my fingers, but then I use a piece of rolled up saran wrap to press it in and to just kind of even out a little bit of the wrinkles. There aren't too many wrinkles on this at all. And then I put my varnish over it and I let it dry. And then for this one, I will also be ready to do the blending all around the whole bucket. I'm going to do the exact same thing, stipple all around it. You would think it'd be easier because it's such a light color, but it wasn't easier. And I did find another place to put the camera so you could see it a little better. Unfortunately, it's a little boring because there's not a lot of color, but I'm using 4 different colors. I have a gray, a soft green, a beige, actually 5, an off-white, and I also have the color, sea salt. And again, it really comes to life. It is chalk synthesis paint, and any of the chalk paints, once they are top coated, is when the colors really are enhanced. Stippling on a metal bucket does do a number on your paintbrush, but these paintbrushes are great. They're super, super reasonable, and I have a link to them in the description. We use them for everything, and I have yet to throw one away. They're super. You'll see I am using a smaller brush just to fill in some of the detail above the paper that I wasn't able to get the stippling brush in because I do not want to destroy that design. I love that black filigree that goes around the sheep picture. And that's just about done. Once this is all, I finish all the stippling, I go over the whole thing with another coat of varnish, and it is done. Thank you so much for watching our video, and hopefully you've enjoyed it. And if you have an old galvanized bucket somewhere, you can certainly try one of these techniques. You don't need a sap bucket. Any bucket will do. And we use these for waste baskets and to store things, and I use them a lot to put stuff in at the shop. But any bucket will do.